action is taken before someone is harmed, so that there's a focus on early intervention and crucially prevention. That harmful behaviour is identified and stopped. That's by focusing on the perpetrator. Increasing safety for everyone at risk, so that's making sure that there are really high quality responses once somebody has experienced harm. And then finally, the ability for people to live the life they want after harm has happened, so focus there on recovery. So I just wanted to say a little bit about the journey of the Domestic Abuse Bill. Some of you who have not necessarily been following it may not know that it was first announced in 2017. So for those of us in the sector who've been following it all the way through, it's been a long old journey, and we often say we feel like, you know, we're the grand old Duke of York, because we kept being walked up the hill and then back down again and then up again, because of various elections during that time, and the bill, you know, was you know, kind of failed and then had to come back. But it was finally enacted at the end of April this year. So the Domestic Abuse Bill is now the Domestic Abuse Act. So in this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on a few hidden groups of victims, or those with unmet need the bill does go some way to addressing. Unfortunately, there are plenty of groups that the bill doesn't specifically legislate for. But I'm going to focus on the ones that the bill does, and that means I'm going to specifically look at children, victims of economic abuse, victims who experience issues with housing, and then finally I'm going to just share some data that we have on victims with protected characteristics who aren't specifically sort of provided for within the bill, but are really important. I see there are some issues here. Let me just double check what's happening. Can you see the slides?
I can certainly see, but I don't know who. Yeah, it looks like some people can.
Is anyone else having difficulty seeing the slides?
I can't see them, but it's saying something went wrong when loading the presentation. Please try reloading, which I've done, so it's maybe my end, not to worry.
Okay, I'm so sorry about that. It does say that another user took control, so someone else is in control of the presentation. So let me just double check. Oh, can everyone? Did everyone see that now?
Not anymore.
No, you've just switched it off.
Okay, hold on 2 seconds. So sorry about this. Sometimes it goes very smoothly, and then other times it doesn't. I'm just waiting for Teams to let me reload it. 2 seconds. I think it's turned off for everybody. Apologies. Okay. For anyone who's just joining, I'm just trying to get my presentation back and up on screen. So 2 seconds. It's just loading again. Somebody has said that there's no sound. Can you not hear me? Anybody? Or can you hear me okay?
Jessica, yeah.
I can hear you. And the presentation's back up too.
Phew. Okay.
And you're sharing again, so that looks good to me.
Fantastic. Great. Okay. Apologies, for some reason it's not coming up my side, so I'm just waiting for it to load. I think it's because people are still coming in, so that's sort of making Teams thinking it's not working. Oh, what a shame. Okay.
I think people can hear you and see the presentation, but
Okay, I'm just trying to navigate forward now. Okay, can you see that slide? Okay, great. So as I was saying, I'm going to be focusing on those victims that are specifically provided for in terms of the bill. But there are some that haven't been specifically legislated for, so I'm going to cover the issues that they face at the end of this presentation. So first of all, I want to focus on children as victims in their own right.
Don't worry, I'd see when you put it out.
Oh, can you all mute, please? Could you mute, please, if you've just come in? Thank you. The new statutory definition of domestic abuse, it includes children for the first time, acknowledging that they're victims in their own right, which is a fantastic step forward. And it wasn't in the definition when the bill was first placed in Parliament, but a huge effort by children's charities working alongside victims' organisations in the women's sector were able to convince the government to acknowledge children as victims in their own right. So the definition includes children who see, hear or experience the effects of abuse between parents or relatives. And a child is defined as a person under 18 years old. Unfortunately, there are no sort of statutory rights to specialist services for children, but we think that this change in the definition can help multi-agency professionals focus on the impact of children living with abuse. It's really important, therefore, that local authorities and other multi-agency partners review their commissioning of specialist children's services, which are still very patchy across the country. So, for example, an Action for Children report in 2019 found that in 4 out of 30 local authorities that they surveyed, there were no support services available at all for children affected by domestic abuse. I just wanted to talk a little bit about what the impact of domestic abuse is on children from some of our data and from others. We've found that at the time that they start school, at least one child in every classroom will have been living with domestic abuse since they were born. And we know that infants, children and adolescents are significantly impacted, whether they experience it by living in a home where domestic abuse is taking place, or experience abuse and coercive controlling behaviour in their own intimate relationships. We know that children can also be impacted during and after the parental separation process. We know that sadly, for a large proportion of domestic homicides, those occur within 6 months of the victim separating from their abusive partner. While many adult victims don't want to have children's social care involvement, which they can experience as coercive and threatening, there is clearly a gap in the knowledge that children's social care sometimes have of children living in a household where there is high risk of serious harm or homicide. We know that when they are aware of this, the signs of abuse can sometimes be mischaracterised as neglect, which may drive children's social care down a specific route for intervention that may be ineffective in addressing abuse. Such an intervention can sometimes actually even make it worse, as it could trigger disguised compliance on the part of both parents. And as you can see here, just under half of young people exposed to domestic abuse were being directly harmed by the family member. So making sure that all professionals look at that whole household in the round is really, really important, rather than just focusing on one part of the family. We know as well that a quarter of young people who are exposed to domestic abuse can go on to demonstrate harmful behaviour of their own, either within their own relationships or within their own families. And in 61% of those cases, the abuse is directed towards their mother. So while not all children who live in abusive households will become abusive to their parents or to their future partners, or indeed become victims, we know through the adverse childhood experiences data that there is a strong correlating factor for a proportion of children who grow up in abusive households. So as I said, we know that specialist interventions for children and young people are currently poorly provided. And we're hoping that this change in the legislation will ensure that actually there is an increase in specialist provision. And when we talk about specialist provision, those are interventions that are specifically designed by specialist charities, particularly women's and children's charities, to help work with a child and any other family members affected by domestic abuse. More recently, during the COVID pandemic, we found that of our frontline practitioner service, that's domestic abuse services particularly, that they found it really difficult to connect with young people in the last year. And we know that that is true for many, many agencies, not just in the voluntary and community sector. Statutory services are thinly stretched, including those providing early intervention programmes for children in need. And we know that even since 2010, there has been quite a significant reduction in the number of domestic abuse services providing dedicated children and young people services, often due to the fact that obviously we've been going through a sort of a long time of the funding being reduced to local government partners. Many young people still rely on services that are designed for adults. And many young people tell us that that's exactly what they don't want and why they don't want to engage with those services. Safe Lives innovated a role called the Young People's Violence Advisor, and they work specifically with children and young people in their own intimate partner relationships. But unfortunately, there are very, very few of them across the country, unlike IDVA's, Independent Domestic Violence Advisors, who work with adult victims. So that's one of the things that we're encouraging local commissioners to increase in terms of their provision. We calculate that around £330 million is the annual cost of services provision for all children and young people affected by domestic abuse. But unfortunately, there is no dedicated strand of funding attached to this bill, this new act, that would enable those services to be provided. There is dedicated funding in relation to accommodation-based services, and I'll be talking about that slightly later on in the presentation. Many of you will know about these forms of interventions, but I just wanted to cover them very briefly because there are a range of specialist services that can be very helpful to think about providing in your local area. So the most common domestic abuse intervention is group-based psychoeducation, then followed by therapeutic support, obviously programmes for children and young people alongside the non-abusive parent, often mothers, young people's violence advisors that I've just mentioned, and then finally preschool children's interventions. There aren't many of those across the country, but we've specifically developed one in concert with a local specialist domestic abuse service called Monkey Bob, which has just recently received its evaluation. And in terms of where we've been developing in Norfolk and West Sussex, these are the outcomes from some of those children and young people's interventions. Those figures might be a little bit small on your screen, but we worked alongside survivors and experts by experience to carry out extensive research to identify the inconsistencies that exist nationally in the response to domestic abuse. And our Connect interventions specifically work across the whole age range of children and young people to ensure that they've got the most appropriate service for their needs. One of the other things that we really hope will be spurred on by the Domestic Abuse Act is what we call cultural change training. We were funded by the Home Office to develop a pilot for children's social workers to ensure that there was a much deeper understanding of coercive and controlling behaviour and their impact on children affected by domestic abuse. We know that when Ofsted did their joint targeted area inspection, that they found that domestic abuse was the most common factor in the lives of children who need social care services. And that's why we really, really encourage all multi-agency partners, but specifically children's social care, to ensure that staff have the really in-depth training and understanding to help them to both identify where there is domestic abuse and then support the child, but not just the child, the whole family, to ensure they access specialist services. That's just a little bit of information about how we went about the cultural change training approach, which included a mobilisation period, a health check, working with the local authorities that we were doing the pilot with. There was a train the trainer event, and then there was the training itself, which was followed by a Sustaining the Change workshop. and would be more than happy to talk to anyone who is interested in having a little look at that programme to see whether it might be replicated in your area. Those were some of the key findings from our evaluation of the cultural change programme with children's social workers. There was a really high sort of sense that this had improved their learning and understanding, but in particular we found that many respondents felt that their knowledge about perpetrators and how they might be manipulated was very much improved by this programme, and that many said that they would be working much more with perpetrators going forward to ensure that the focus was on reducing the harm in the household rather than just holding the non-abusive parent to account. So that's a focus on children in the bill. And I just wanted to move on to economic abuse, which is another big change in terms of the way that domestic abuse is being looked at going forward. So economic abuse includes financial abuse. So financial abuse sits underneath it. And this is a graphic from a brilliant specialist charity called Surviving Economic Abuse, who I'll talk about in a couple of slides. But those give a few examples. So financial abuse is controlling finances, stealing money, or coercing someone into debt. Whereas economic abuse is the kind of overall category, is financial abuse plus restricting, exploiting, or sabotaging other resources such as housing, food, property, transportation, and employment. So the definition of domestic abuse, the statutory definition in the new Act, will include economic abuse for the first time. And it's defined that it's any behaviour that has a substantial adverse effect on the victim's ability to acquire, use or maintain money or other property, or obtain goods or services. And as I said, Surviving Economic Abuse is the lead charity dedicated to raising awareness of this issue and changing the response to it. They provide a fantastic range of resources for both frontline professionals as well as survivors themselves. And I've put a link in the slide just here, but if you Google Surviving Economic Abuse, you can have a little look through their toolkits yourself. So what can agencies do to prepare themselves for the new Act? Well, the first thing is to ensure once again that multi-agency professionals are trained to understand economic abuse. The second is to provide referral pathways to organisations that can support victims. So I've included here the financial support line for victims of domestic abuse. And that's provided between Surviving Economic Abuse and the Money Advice Plus service. It offers specialist advice to survivors of domestic abuse and financial difficulty. And then the third way that local authorities and other commissioners can ensure that economic abuse survivors are supported is by thinking about their specific needs. Many survivors will have been prevented from accessing funding or money, or will be in quite serious debt because of the coercive controlling behaviour of their perpetrator. And therefore they can find it very difficult to move to a place of safety because they're unable to access, for example, money to pay for van removal, and often will have issues in terms of accessing food or children's clothing and uniforms, for example. So ensuring that there are charitable funds or local authority funds locally that those survivors can access is really, really important, particularly when you're thinking about them becoming safe. So the next section I just wanted to focus on the accommodation-based duty in the Domestic Abuse Act, and also very briefly the kind of new rules on secure tenancies. So the new duty on local authorities is to provide support for victims of domestic abuse and their children in refuges and other safe accommodation. And there's currently a consultation out at the moment on statutory guidance, which defines what safe accommodation means. But these are the main categories. Dispersed accommodation, but that has to be where there is a level of specialist domestic abuse support. Sanctuary schemes, which are properties within local authorities that have installed sanctuary schemes or other similar schemes which provide enhanced physical security measures. So that might be panic rooms or alarms, real target hardening on doors and windows and things like that. And then move on or second stage accommodation. But once again, it's really, really important that those forms of accommodation are plus support, so specialist support, rather than just generic housing options. While we hugely welcome this new duty on local authorities, we are concerned that the amount of funding allocated by the government isn't going to be enough to cover the real needs. So Women's Aid figures suggest that 173 million is required for refuge provision in England alone, but only 125 million has been allocated. And of course, we've got a number of other categories of accommodation-based support there. So we're really hoping that there will be an increase in the funding for this particular duty in the next funding round. So this is just a definition of domestic abuse safe accommodations. It's not generic temporary accommodation. It has to be solely dedicated to providing a safe space to stay for victims of domestic abuse and their children. Any other kind of forms of accommodation can't be commissioned under this particular duty in the Domestic Abuse Act. And all support provided under this duty must be provided to all adult and child victims of domestic abuse and meet quality standards. So those are the MHCLG quality standards, Women's Aid National Quality Standards and or IMCAN accredited quality standards. And they're all easily found if you Google them. The government has been really clear that the introduction of this duty shouldn't impact on non-accommodation based local domestic abuse services, so what we refer to as community-based support. And it's expected that support in safe accommodation should sit alongside and complement the support that is already available to victims, so that we know that about 70 to 80% of victims will access community-based support rather than refuge. And so it's really important that as this duty is rolled out, that there isn't any decline in the sort of services provided, particularly, for example, IDFA and outreach services. So we're really hoping that community-based services are being involved in the conversations about this new duty, and particularly in terms of developing the needs assessments, the local strategy and domestic abuse partnership boards. Under this duty, authorities must ensure appropriate and adequate support which meets the needs of all victims, including those with relevant protected characteristics and or multiple complex needs. So we know that there have been real issues in terms of accommodation-based support not meeting the needs of victims from Black, Asian and minoritized communities, particularly disabled survivors really struggle to access refuge support, which may not be accessible. But also learning disabled survivors are often not admitted to refuge accommodation because there aren't the specialist workers to be able to work with them. So when you're thinking about commissioning these services, make sure that you're working very closely with either your by and for specialist community services at the local area, or if you don't have those, then IMCAN can put you in touch with a number of organisations nationally that are doing a lot of guidance specifically in this space. We know that in terms of no recourse to public funds, that just under 10% of women turned away from refuge had NRPF status. It's really important that local authorities specifically commission spaces for victims with NRPF to ensure that they're not leaving victims to become homeless as per the Homeless Reduction Act. Otherwise, they're simply forced to go back to dangerous perpetrators. And we know that a number of women with NRPF simply just return back to the perpetrators because they simply don't have the support. And, you know, it's very unsafe for them to be on the street. As we can see from the Nowhere to Turn report by Women's Aid, complex needs is also a barrier to accessing safe accommodation. So as I said, it's really important to consider those with needs such as mental health and substance misuse, for whom refuge may not always be suitable, but who will require additional and intensive support. We've sort of noted two schemes here that could be considered for these victims: Housing First, and I've given a link there, and Shared Lives. Sorry, see the next slide, which is just going to give you a brief explanation of Shared Lives. So Shared Lives is a UK membership organisation and charity, and they mostly provide services to those with mental health issues and learning disabilities. But recently, Safe Lives has been working in partnership with Shared Lives, two very similar sounding organisations, to pilot their support for domestic abuse survivors. Shared Lives hosts Share Their Homes with a victim who needs support and for whom refuge does not meet their support needs. Or they may no longer require refuge, but they need a stepping stone before living independently. The pilot that we were involved in supported disabled and non-disabled women who had experienced domestic abuse as an alternative to or as a move on from refuge, and the evaluation from that is due soon, so please look out for that. So we must also consider those who are street homeless and hidden homeless, and we know from our Safe Lives, Safe at Home Spotlight that domestic abuse is not always the cause of homelessness. But it is often experienced alongside other forms of disadvantage that may contribute to homelessness. So there's a number of figures here, but it shows that St Mungo's found that 32% of the women they worked with in 2013 said that domestic abuse was a factor contributing to their homelessness, compared to 8% of men. And of those women who rough sleep, 35% left home to escape violence. So it's important that domestic abuse and other forms of violence against women and girls are considered when assessing homelessness applications, to ensure that appropriate and tailored support can be provided to victims. Obviously, many of the local authorities who might be on the line will be going through their kind of needs assessments and pulling together the local partnership boards in relation to this new duty, as well as, of course, starting to look at the strategies required. We've heard recently that MHCLG have extended the deadline for this huge piece of work to be finished by 2 October. So hopefully that sort of enabled a little bit of breathing space in order to get this really right. But in order to provide the best service to victims, we really recommend that training for all housing staff is provided. So that's homelessness teams, housing options, housing officers across all housing providers. So that's not just the council, but RSLs, private landlords, so that there is that understanding of domestic abuse right across the piece. We think that a trauma-informed and person-centred approach should be taken, really understanding why a person might be presenting in the way that they are. And for cases where a person is threatened with eviction due to rent arrears or antisocial behaviour, sometimes this can be mistaken when it's actually domestic abuse. And so for making sure that you really understand who the perpetrator is to respond to that effectively is really important. So taking a whole system approach is key. We support the Domestic Abuse Housing Alliance whole housing approach. And this diagram sort of gives you an understanding of how that whole housing approach works. So we would definitely, if you're looking at your sort of Domestic Abuse Act duties in terms of this new duty, would definitely encourage you to work with DAHA when you're thinking about putting that together. And then finally, I'd say just a little bit about secure tenancies. So the new Act requires local authorities, when rehousing an existing lifetime social tenant or offering them a new sole tenancy in their own home, to grant a new lifetime tenancy if the local authority is satisfied that the tenant or a member of their household has been a victim of domestic abuse. It's really important. We know that so many victims are threatened by their perpetrators, that if they were to leave the household, then they'll lose their tenancy and they'll never be able to get it back again. So we're really pleased that this bill makes provision for this particular issue. And just finally, I just wanted to look at some other key measures in the Domestic Abuse Act. So many of you will have heard that there's a new Domestic Abuse Commissioner. She's actually been interim for over a year, doing an excellent job, and she's now confirmed in post. She'll have functions and powers, and in particular, she's got specific provision to make sure that the particular aspects around those with unmet need or protected characteristics are absolutely sort of in focus for both her role, but also holding the government to account. There's a new Domestic Abuse Protection Order. So you will know that there's a domestic violence protection order in at the moment, but it's a breach of which is a civil offence. This makes a breach of that new depot a criminal offence, and we hope that that will mean that it's more powerful and perpetrators really do abide by it, because at the moment there's lots of breaches. Unfortunately, perpetrators get away with breaches frequently. The new DA Act also prohibits perpetrators of domestic abuse from cross-examining their victims in person in the family courts, and preventing victims from having to cross-examine their abusers. These particular measures aren't going to be coming into place until we hear spring next year, but this will be a huge step forward for survivors going through the family court process. Similarly, the statutory presumption that domestic abuse complainants are eligible for special measures, that's also going to make a huge difference for those situations in family courts. Clare's Law, which is otherwise known as the Domestic Violence Disclosure Scheme, is going to be placed on a statutory footing. Once again, another excellent move. And then there were a couple of sort of late additions into the bill, including this one around rough sex, which is the rough sex defence to be outlawed. Unfortunately, we still think there were some kind of key gaps in the Domestic Abuse Act, and so while there doesn't necessarily need to be legislation to meet all of these issues, we do think that in the Victims Bill that the government's going to be introducing, we think early next year, we're hoping to see some of these things included instead. So there's no measures to increase the provision of specialist services in community-based settings. So we've said, well, if you're going to have a duty for accommodation-based provision, then you ought to be doing it for community-based settings as well, because actually many services will be providing both. But the government's going to be consulting on the future of community-based services in the consultation for the Victims Bill this summer. So we will be sort of mounting a big campaign to convince the government to include a specific duty to provide CBS services in that. Unfortunately, we were unsuccessful in getting a principle of non-discrimination into the Domestic Abuse Act, which would have ensured that those victims with protected characteristics, so Black and minority victims, disabled victims, LGBT+, and older victims, were able to access specialist services through services designed for them. Under 16s experiencing abuse in intimate partner relationships are not considered victims of domestic abuse. So the definition of domestic abuse is 16 and over, but we know that many under 16-year-olds will be experiencing abuse in their intimate relationships. So we really want to see commissioners ensuring that they've got provision in place for them. Once again, no measures to ensure victims with NRPF to access specialist services, but we're very much hoping that as part of the needs assessment for the new accommodation-based duty that many local authorities will be bringing these particular victims into view. Once again, there were no measures or funding to increase training for frontline public sector workers to ensure that this Act really does kind of hit home with everyone being skilled to the kind of right level. But we're working with government and agencies to ensure that in terms of the implementation of the Act, that there is going to be that kind of cultural change training that I talked about earlier rolled out for everybody. Once again, there were also sadly no measures to quality assure perpetrator interventions. At the moment, there isn't a kind of quality assurance framework except for that provided by Respect, but that's not on a statutory footing, so we'd very much like to see that change. And also very little role for health services specified in the Act itself. We've been campaigning for a long time for there to be access to IDVA services in hospitals and also in mental health trusts. And there's a fantastic programme called IRIS, which is a sort of primary care intervention. But unfortunately, this Act didn't really look at health in relation to domestic abuse. So once again, we're really hoping that the new women's health strategy might include some more measures in that space. And then finally, another key gap was that there wasn't any commitment to long-term awareness raising campaigns. We know that many local areas do this really brilliantly, but what's really needed is for state and society to come together to say there is no excuse for abuse, and to do that at national level in the way that we would if you're thinking about domestic abuse. It affects 2.4 million people every year. There are lots and lots of public health issues that have that high reach, and yet they get sort of a lot of funding every year. So, for example, the number of deaths from fire each year can be sort of similarly seen as to the number of deaths from domestic abuse each year. And yet Fire Kills gets about £1 million of public funding each year for that campaign, but domestic abuse doesn't get anything. So we're campaigning to try and change that. And I said I'd finally just look a little bit at the data that we have on these particularly protected characteristic groups of survivors. What you're seeing here are a number of reports that we did under the banner of our Spotlight series. So please do go and have a look at our website to be able to access these particular reports with the huge amount of data and survivor voice in them. But just to take you through really quickly, this is what we found about children and young people experiencing domestic abuse in their intimate relationships. And we found that it had the highest prevalence rates of domestic abuse in terms of the 16 to 19 age bracket. And that 50% of young people in abusive relationships have been exposed to abuse in their family homes previously. So showing there that actually focusing on teenage victims is really important. Similarly, we know that older victims are really hidden, and they're also experiencing abuse for about 6.5 years in terms of our data set, which is twice as long as those who are under 65. So there are some victims in the data set who've been experiencing abuse for 20 years or more before getting support. And even considering this, 80% of victims are not identified or visible to services. So we know that there's a lot to be done in terms of making sure that we're really seeing those older victims of abuse and ensuring they're getting the specialist support they need. Once again, disabled victims are more likely to be suffering abuse from a current partner than non-disabled victims, and they're more than twice as likely to be experiencing abuse from an adult family member than a non-disabled client. We know that disabled victims are likely to be experiencing quite high levels of abuse as well, because they're sort of really kind of double isolated, I guess. So making sure that you've got specific kind of interventions and commissioning strands for disabled victims is really important. And LGBT plus victims, once again, certainly we know that they're twice as likely to have attempted suicide, and they're more than twice as likely to have self-harmed as well, and they're more likely to be abused by multiple perpetrators. So once again, it's a relatively hidden group of victims who will be right across the country. So it's really important once again to be focused on their needs. Oh, somebody's just come off mute. Sorry. And then finally, so-called honour-based abuse and forced marriage. Another really high harm, high severity group. You know, we do say the term hidden in inverted commas. We also say the term honour-based abuse in inverted commas. These groups are not necessarily hidden. It's just that we're not necessarily seeing them. And it's really important that we do focus on them specifically in terms of commissioning. So I just wanted to end with a survivor quote from an amazing woman called Rachel Williams, who survived being shot by her very abusive partner. And she works with us to make sure that everything that we design works very closely with survivors. And she says, I don't want in my lifetime to possibly see an end to domestic abuse. I want it to become a reality, and we must all make this happen. So thank you very much for listening to me. I'm sorry I'm slightly over with the technical problems at the beginning, but happy to take any questions or have any comments. And I don't know whether anybody wants to go first. Okay. So can I ask, does the new Act allow private tenancies to be reissued when the victim has shared tenancy with the perpetrator? My understanding is that is, yes, the intention of what the new Act is trying to do. It's really important because that's obviously the biggest sticking point. But yeah, I think that's the point of the changes that have been put forward. I did see a hand go up, but I don't think I can see it any longer. So was there anyone else who had a question?
That was me. We've already answered my question. Thank you.
All right, okay. Does anyone else want to ask any questions? Or you can write them in the chat. I can see them as well. And yes, I'm more than happy to share the slides. I can see lots of people asking that. It would be really useful to kind of understand any feedback on how the rollout of the new safe accommodation duty is going in your local area, if you're engaging with that. Oh, there's a question here. Okay, 2 seconds. I'm just trying to have a look at them. So my question is around under 16s. Yeah, if they want to take it to the police, is it considered assault, or what can the perpetrator be charged with? It's a really interesting question. Fundamentally, you know, if it's high harm abuse, then absolutely it's criminal. And of course, there are young people who are charged. But what we don't want to see is the over-criminalisation of this particular group of young people who, as our data shows, themselves will have often experienced abuse in their own home growing up. Really what they need is that kind of specialist support, both for the victim, but also for the young person who's using harmful behaviours, because we know that if actually they go into a kind of criminal justice route, then actually the kind of essence of why they might be using harmful behaviours isn't addressed, and it doesn't actually get to the root cause of what might be sitting behind their use of harmful behaviours, which, as I say, from our data, maybe because they've experienced serious trauma themselves as they've been growing up. So while absolutely in the most extreme cases, the police do need to get involved, it's very important that that victim is protected, and we'd like to obviously see that victim getting access to a young people's violence advisor, and of course that YIPFA can then work with that young person as to whether they want that to take that to the police or not, and there may be some really good reasons for them not to want to disclose to the police, but the main thing is that their needs are supported first and foremost. In terms of the second question, how can you prove the perpetrator is mentally abusing your children if it's your word against his? Well, I think that what is interesting is that a lot of people sort of start from the point that this is like tit for tat, or it's just, his against her word, and actually there's a lot that you can do to evidence coercive controlling behaviour by asking the right questions. So, for example, in our Domestic Abuse Matters Police Cultural Change programme, what we try to ensure is that the officers in that programme aren't just looking for evidence of, bruises or other forms of physical violence, but they are actually asking survivors about how their life feels. So, sorts of questions like, how do you feel when you wake in the morning? Does anyone make you feel afraid at home? And then thinking about some of the things that I've been talking about in terms of, say, economic abuse. Are there kind of regular things that you're not allowed to do? Do they let you, see your friends and your family? Are they letting you have access to social media? Do you have to let them know all of your passwords to social media? Those sorts of things can actually help build a picture of what that perpetrator is doing in terms of coercive control. And sometimes we'll be doing the same in terms of the children. And that then enables you to sort of build an evidence base to then support that. And you quickly find that, it isn't just your word against his. So I think it's all about the kind of professional curiosity that you can bring, rather than sort of saying, well, she's told me this and he's told me the opposite, so that's just a situation I can't get involved with. But we would always recommend that where there is domestic abuse in the family, that victim is given access to a specialist service that multi-agency partners can work alongside, because they can actually help to work with that victim to get that evidence if required. Obviously, the other thing I would say is that it's really important that you focus on the perpetrator as well. So perpetrator interventions such as DRIVE, which is a high harm intervention that we've pioneered alongside Respect and also Social Finance, is showing some really important sort of benefits, and happy to sort of share that evaluation so that you can see that. At lower risk levels, there are also obviously group work programmes. And we've also started a new programme for couples who aren't separating or who may need to have child contact, and that's called Engage. That's been piloted in Norfolk and West Sussex and is currently being rolled out in Cheshire as well. So there's a question here that says, is there any data that shows whether unpaid carers are at an increased risk of being victims of abuse? It's a really interesting question, and I don't think that I have seen any evidence. But Stay Safe East is an amazing specialist domestic abuse service for disabled survivors of abuse. And obviously they work a lot around who is abusing. And unfortunately, sometimes that is carers abusing their clients. But I don't think we've ever heard about whether carers themselves are at an increased risk of being victims. So I think sort of that's one I can't answer, but definitely a useful research question. Any info on how successful perpetrator programmes are? Right, so I've already mentioned DRIVE, which has had its evaluation from the University of Bristol, and I can pop the link to that evaluation in here. There was also an evaluation called Project Mirabelle, which looked at a number of different perpetrator programmes and looked at their evidence base. I think what I would say is that Respect is the main charity that oversees perpetrator programmes. It has accreditation, which is fantastic. So I would always be choosing a programme that had Respect accreditation if you're looking at high quality effectiveness, but also knowing that you're getting a programme that's going to actually not make victims less safe and is likely to actually increase the perpetrator's ability to sort of rehabilitate. How does the bill impact on the use of the dash? There is no impact from the bill on the use of the dash. The dash risk assessment is obviously it's been rolled out by Safe Lives to multi-agency partners and is used widely across many agencies and is an important tool obviously for assessing access to MARAC. Obviously what we will hope is that there will be obviously some changes in terms of MARAC guidance to reflect some of the developments in the Domestic Abuse Act, but the dash itself won't change. One has 24 questions, another has 27. I can't answer that from a practice perspective because I think it all depends on who the 27 dash has been designed for. I think that the 24 dash might be a police tool, but I might be wrong in that. But I can take that away, Peter, and get back to you if you wanted to pop your email into the meeting chat, and I can ask our practice team to help you on that one. In terms of continue experiencing not enough evidence from the police and as a result no conviction made, evidence from behind a closed door is difficult and frustrating. It absolutely is, but I think once again it's about first of all, have your police had the domestic abuse matters coercive controlling behaviour training in your local force? If they haven't, then I would definitely encourage you to write to Police and Crime Commissioner and to others to encourage them to get it. If they have had the training, then domestic abuse matters forces have champions within the force. So sometimes it might be that they just need to do a refresher of the training. But I think it's about everybody, whether that's police officers or children's social care workers, adult social care, health professionals. Actually, the evidence may actually, as we know from a lot of DHRs, be contained in other agencies' notes. So it really is about that importance of information sharing, so that if one agency doesn't have it, another might do. But I agree, it is very frustrating and very difficult. Have we seen an increase during lockdown in domestic abuse? Absolutely. The National Domestic Abuse Helpline had a 65% increase in calls, which has pretty much been sustained now. So I think it's dropped to 61% above baseline in the last few months, but it's still very, very high. And we knew that there was going to be an increase in violence against women and girls because unfortunately that is what the academic literature shows right across the world, whether it was Hurricane Katrina, or the Deepwater oil sort of disaster. We know that studies afterwards show that there was an increase. So in crises, suddenly violence against women and girls increases. In terms of the local level, we did a practitioner survey that ran from November to January, so November 2020 to January this year. And 9 out of 10 services said that they had seen an increase in demand. And in particular, they'd seen an increase in complexity of cases. So many survivors with much higher mental health needs, drug and alcohol misuse needs, many who had not been able to reach out during lockdown proper and were only able to reach out once the restrictions had lessened again. So unfortunately, I think we expect to see victims continuing to reach out across the next few years, and a really quite high level of burden on both frontline specialist services, but also other agencies, particularly mental health, going forward. Is there a statutory requirement to provide perpetrator programmes for those not on probation? No. There isn't. There is sadly no statutory provision or requirement for perpetrators to have to access services, which means that I think our figures show that before Drive was introduced, there were fewer than 1% of perpetrators received any intervention at all. And of course, for us, that's completely the wrong way around. It's the perpetrators who should be held to account for what they're doing, so that we can stop that cycle in the future. Please ask those questions, but students I have worked with are still told not enough evidence and result not taken forward seriously. I mean, once again, we can only go on the evidence, and the latest academic evaluation of the DA Matters cultural change programme I was talking about showed that there was a 41% increase in arrests for coercive controlling behaviour in those forces that had done the training. So we do know that the training is effective, but it's not a silver bullet. It's not the only thing. And I would just go back to the fact that so many of these issues are deeply culturally embedded. And really what we need is for it to not have to reach the police stage. We do not want perpetrators starting abusive behaviour in the first place. And so that has to be a whole country change, a whole kind of public health approach to this issue, rather than just leaving this always for the criminal justice side to pick up. We know that only 1 in 5 victims ever calls the police anyway. So 4 in 5 victims need to be supported elsewhere and outside of the criminal justice system. Got a few more questions to get through just before the end. I think I've got about 5 or 6 minutes. So there's a question here from John who says, are there any plans for more mainstream work with children, in particular those at risk, as part of a future reduction programme through education and awareness? Well, I mean, we would always advocate on behalf of specialist provision, because that's where we know we've been able to evaluate there is the kind of best outcomes from that specialist dedicated provision that understands the needs, the holistic needs of children, young people, as well as working with the non-abusive parent and the perpetrator. So for us, we'd like to see mainstream funding, so we'd like to see an increase in government funding and local authority and other commissioners' funding for specialist children's work. But in terms of education awareness, we obviously have now got mandatory RSHE in schools, which do include segments on healthy relationships and also understanding consent. We don't feel that at the moment that's necessarily going to be effective enough in order to truly address young people's understanding of what healthy relationships are. And we know that because we're doing a huge programme of work with young people themselves. They do not see the behaviours that they experience or perpetrate as domestic abuse. They'll often talk about unhealthy relationships or toxic behaviour. And we know that many young people will not turn to professionals first for support or advice. They'll turn to their peers and they'll turn to their family. So developing tools and ways of educating and informing those young people in the spaces they're in, which are now often online, is one of the focuses of that particular strand of work in Safe Lives. So we very much hope that the education and awareness piece is going to be a much bigger part of what the government focuses on too. And obviously we've had everyone's invited, which we hope will be a spur to making sure that all young people have access to those sort of materials and resources and peer support networks. I think I might just have time for one more question. So there's a lot here. I'm not going to get through them all. I'm so sorry. But I'm more than happy to maybe answer some of them just by email and them to be circulated along with the slides. So I hope that doesn't disappoint everyone too much. So I'm just looking for a final question. There's one from Jessica Sammers. Can I ask if the couple are foreign and the lady's on the male's visa? Is there any support this act can offer? Right, so yeah, so we're sort of talking here about migrant victims of abuse or those with NRPF. No, sadly, all of the amendments that the migrant women's sector proposed for this bill were rejected by the government. It was just a huge disappointment, I think, from this bill. And as I said, there are plenty of gaps, sadly, in the bill. But we will continue to campaign to make sure that migrant victims get access to specialist domestic abuse services, no matter what their background is. Whether they're on a spousal visa, or whether they're, they've come into the country and they've been trafficked, or whether they're perpetrated, which often happens, takes away their passport, makes their visa run out, and then they know that they're here illegally, and then they use that against them. Those are things that sadly the Act didn't change. But I would point you towards some fantastic organisations that do support women in these situations, particularly Southall Black Sisters, which is a fantastic service that operates out of London. And also you can find more local services through IMCAN. So they're a national membership body for organisations that provide that by and for support, both for migrant victims, but also for those who are from Black, Asian and minoritized statuses. So yeah, I just ask you to make sure you're reaching out to those services, funding them locally for sure. And hopefully we'll be able to get some of the migrant victims amendments through in the Victims Bill. So thank you ever so much to all of you who've come today. I've been seeing it's quite a lot of you. I hope that you enjoyed that. I'll send around the slides and any questions I wasn't able to answer. And just enjoy Safeguarding Week and keep all that amazing work I know that you all do going.
Jessica, could I just ask, in terms of the recording, are you happy for this to be on, for the rest of this week, or?
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely. The more people who can see it, the better.
Great, thank you. And I'll PDF the slides if you can send me those, and I'll put them on the website and share the link. And also the evaluation link as well. I put that on the chat, but in terms of that, I'll email it out to the participants as well.
Brilliant. Okay, well, thank you ever so much to everybody. And I don't know whether I'll have access to all the questions, but there were definitely a couple there that I couldn't answer. So I might try and send you the answers so you can circulate